it's like, wait a second. No regular questions.
Okay.
Stop.
Yeah, we're going to start now.
If somebody asks what's your favorite dinosaur, I'm just going to leave.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to the first Kavli Conversation of this semester, the spring semester here at the NYU Arthur Carter Journalism Institute. My name's Dan Fagan. I'm a professor of journalism here and the director of the Science, Health, and Environmental Reporting Program and the Science Communication Workshops, which is just a long way of saying that we're really into science communication here at NYU. And it's a pleasure and an honor to have Shaena Montanari and Brian Switek here, who are not only really into fossils, they're also really into figuring out how to talk about fossils. So I'm looking forward to learning a lot, and as always, our moderator is the esteemed Robert Lee Holtz, science writer at the Wall Street Journal, distinguished writer in residence here at NYU. And I believe this may be the 100th event that Lee Holtz has moderated. Which is really
very scary.
Which is really
very
quite
scary.
astonishing.
So intimidating.
I'm not going to swear it's the 100th, but I defy anyone to figure out how to fact
Really?
check me on that. I don't think it's fact checkable, so I'm going with it because that's what we do. So Lee, take it away.
Well, thank you, Professor Fagan. I'm not sure about that centenary thing. That makes me think I've been running at the mouth a little bit. So anyway, thank you very much, all of you here and all of you who are watching us online, for joining us on this dark and stormy night in New York City for what really is the first of the spring series of Kavli Conversations on science communications. Our goal here, for those of you who have not joined us before, really is to explore how important science issues and information best reach the general public. And to that end, we bring together the best of both worlds, a prominent science writer and a successful scientist who both reach out to the public about matters affecting the same field of research. So we get the view from both sides of the fence. And I want to look forward here just for a second while I have you as a captive audience. We have a really intriguing lineup this spring. On March 12th, we'll be joined by Dr. Death, otherwise known, for those of you who follow podcasts, that's Laura Beale, a award-winning and very distinguished medical writer. And with her will be Dr. Marty Makary, who's a remarkable medical practitioner who's worked very closely with ProPublica and other outlets to identify surgeons, malpractice cases, things like that. On March 27th, we'll be delving into what we like to call vidsplaining, but really video science storytelling with Jesse Fong and Anna Rothschild. And to conclude on April 24th, we'll be sitting down with NPR's Alex Spiegel on matters of psychology, behavior, and her podcast, Invisibilia. But so I urge you all to join us for those, and hopefully the weather will be better. But for tonight and every night, these, I want to remind you, are conversations. This is not a lecture. This is not a book talk. This is a conversation, and we invite your questions as you proceed. For those of you here, please do us and those who are listening from the ether the favor of going over to the microphone so they can hear your question and we can record it for later broadcast and archiving. And those of you who are out there in the cybersphere with Doctor Who and everyone else, we invite your questions also, and we ask you to send them to us via the hashtag Kavli Convo. That's Kavli Convo. So, tonight, Tonight we're here to explore actually really a matter of evolution, how we evolve as researchers, as science communicators, as journalists. And this is a conversation that's actually rooted in our most ancient, deepest past, because it begins in the age of the dinosaurs, where extinction events and the pace of change is measured in geologic time. And it is a conversation that sprawls across a more modern media landscape, blogs and freelance gigs and such, where time is measured in clicks and in replays. So we are joined by two stellar figures from the field and world of paleontology. One a writer and one a scientist. One a writer who's a wannabe scientist. One a scientist who's a wannabe writer. Because this is kind of what we're talking about. We're all hybrids here. We're all hybrids. We're all moving from one thing into another. We're all evolving in our tastes and interests and how we express them. And so we are from the not dank state of Utah. We are joined by a collection of 206 or so bones named Brian Switek, who is a well-known blogger. His blog, Laylaps, which we'll talk about in a little bit, has gone through a number of stables, like a
mutations.
like a well-respected racehorse. It's had a number of stalls where it's parked, and author of a number of well-regarded books, including Written in Stone, which was his first. His second, My Beloved Brontosaurus. He wrote an entire single issue of National Geographic called When Dinosaurs Ruled, and also a children's book, Prehistoric Predators. He is the author of a new book, which is coming out this month, called Skeleton Keys, which has strangely materialized in front of me. I'm going to keep an eye on it for the rest of the conversation here, which is about, strangely enough, bones, and from the dawn of evolution 500 plus million years ago to today. That they are not so much, if I may quote from his text, totems of death, not so much totems of death as symbols of reality. And of course, in the wannabe category, Brian is very well known for his own devotion to field work. You can't keep him away from a dinosaur dig, and a big reason why he moved from New Jersey, where he spent much of his life, was not just this cruddy weather, but because, of course, some of the great boneyards of the American West are centered in and around Utah and Wyoming and the Four Corners area. We are, to take the hybrid theme the other way and turn it on its head, we are also joined by Shaena Montanari, who is a working paleontologist. She's currently a fellow at the National Science Foundation Office of Legislative and Public Affairs. She goes to that from a year as a AAAS mass media fellow. She's worked as a science journalist at National Geographic and a science writer and contributor at Forbes, where she covered natural history and paleontology. And prior to that, I think it's fair to point out that Forbes had named her, I think, one of the world's top scientists under 30. It's a signal honor, I think. She's written scripts for PBS Digital Studios and the Science series, It's Okay to Be Smart. But we really respect her because her PhD's in comparative biology, and she was one of the first 4 students, actually, to enter the American Museum of Natural History here in New York when their newly founded graduate school, the Richard Gilder Graduate School. There she analyzed dinosaur teeth and eggs to figure out what the world like that was so long ago. What did they do? How did they eat? What were the temperatures like? It's amazing what you can wring from a tooth or from a shard of eggshell. And one of the things I want to ask about, I guess to start, the two of you have some things in common and some things that set you apart, but you share a topic. It's hard to think of anything that, if you don't mind the analogy or the bad pun, has such a big footprint on the public consciousness as dinosaurs, both in popular culture, both in with children, with adults of differing political persuasions. It seems to be sort of the one thing everybody likes to talk about, whether you're a climate denialist or a creationist or a left-wing Bolshevik who wants to, embrace carbon capture, who knows what. So as we get into this, I want to start here. So this is a topic. Did you choose the topic or did the topic choose you? We'll start with Brian.
Yeah, I loved dinosaurs when I was a kid. When I was 5, I had my first visit to the AMNH here in town. Saw that skeleton of Brontosaurus, as we called it at the time, and I imagined the animal, moving, breathing, what it was like when it was alive. And I already liked dinosaurs quite a bit, but that really solidified it in my head. But my parents and just about everybody else says, like, you can't study dinosaurs if you live in New Jersey. And it's like, well, it turns out some of the first discoveries of dinosaurs that we had in North America were from New Jersey. In fact, the name of my blog, Laylapse, I've been maintaining for so long, was the original name of a tyrannosaur that was found in New Jersey, the second partial skeleton found there. That was the old name before it was changed to Dryptosaurus through the whole, circuitous method of, scientific taxonomy that I'm not going to go into. But, I didn't think that I could make it. So, okay, other things with teeth. Sharks. Sharks are good. I like sharks. Sharks are also ancient. They share a lot in common with dinosaurs. So I went to Rutgers University for marine sciences and found that I was terrible at math and I had no patience for marine chemistry or anything like that. So I started reading scientific papers about fossils and about dinosaurs. So in my early 20s, with that university journal access, going back into some of these papers and books and downloading everything, printing off reams and reams and reams of papers to take back and highlight. And when I should have been in class, I was reading about dinosaurs instead. And to remember what I was learning about, I would blog about it. And this was, in the olden days of blogging, I guess. I guess if I had to put some kind of relative timescale on it, it'd be like after LiveJournal, but just as Blogspot was taking off and WordPress. And I remembered from my education courses that there's the learning period, right, that we all learn about this sort of stuff, where if you can someone tells you something, you may or may not retain it, and each level you go down, it's a better level of retention until you're basically teaching somebody else. So I took that approach and decided, okay, I'm going to read these papers, write about them, and then I'll remember it better. And there was a website at the time called Think Progress that was offering a scholarship for people who blogged about things. And every post that you put up, you got a couple points, and every comment and things like that. I think I came in second place, but what really was important was it gave me the writing bug. Like I was always better at writing than I was at mathematics or any of the typical science stuff. So I basically came back to my love of fossils and dinosaurs, and writing gave me this alternate route to get back into it, to dig into it, to make
So
my own
I just want to understand. So,
Yeah.
because I'm still back with the 8-year-old.
Okay. Okay.
Because
Yeah.
that's a classic American experience. I'm saying it's an American experience. It may be broader than that, but the sort of the childhood,
Western, yeah.
very Western childhood obsession with large things with teeth and claws,
Mm-hmm.
that then kind of gets put behind you, and you move on to other things. And so I just want to make sure I understand what you've told us. So your initial writing, your blogging, that started as a study aid? I mean, did I hear that right?
It basically was, I wasn't happy with what I was learning about in the courses that I felt trapped in, because at Rutgers University, I went to them and I said I would prefer to take some courses in prehistory. There's a whole human evolution department. It's like, okay, bones are bones. I can learn about human anatomy instead of dinosaur anatomy. Dinosaurs have femora, thigh bones just like we do, ribs just like we do. I can at least learn the outline of it if I can transfer into this course line. And they said, no, you're too far along already. You have too many credits. Forget about it. So as my own sort of little protest, like, okay, well, I'll just learn about it on my own and write about it. So I was so taken by it and so fascinated by it that it just needed an outlet. It was just a passion project. I didn't go into this with the intent of becoming a professional writer or a journalist or anything like that. I had to know.
Okay, you had to know it. Passion seeking an outlet. Shaena, there you are, a young woman growing up in Connecticut, right? I mean, are you also 8 years old and playing with, sharp toys that have little wind-up drawers and things? I mean, what's your? No, you come to this late, really?
Yeah. I mean, I always grew up loving. I was primarily in love with animals. I had dogs and cats, and I liked going outside to catch frogs. And I was that was my passion. Also, going to the beach. Growing up, I'd go to Cape Cod every summer. I was really interested in seashells and those kinds of things. So just anything outdoorsy or nature, I was really keen on. And I was just so interested in all types of science, primarily biology, but I just loved science in general. But I wasn't quite sure which one I wanted to study. But I knew I was going to do one of the sciences. And biology was my favorite, animals were my favorite, but I also liked chemistry. And so then when I always said I was going to be a marine biologist, like a lot of young girls say, I'm being a marine biologist. And I got to undergrad. I went to the University of North Carolina. Go Tar Heels. Beat Duke. That's at 9 o'clock, so I got time.
Yes, you'll be all right. You'll be good.
Yeah.
You'll be good.
And so I went to the University of North Carolina, and I started taking some biology classes, and they were interesting. But then I realized, well, I wonder what else is out there. I really can't remember why I decided I was going to go to the geology department and see what kind of classes they had. I think I was just so curious. I wanted to just learn. I think that's always been my thing. I've always wanted to learn almost everything, like almost too many things. So I went to the geology department, and I loved the advisor, and he was just super enthusiastic. And I was like, I'm going to major in geology. Okay. So I went to my first few geology classes, and I loved it and part of the reason I loved it is because they were really small classes at a big university, which was great. It was really hands-on. We're out in the field. In high school, I had an internship at a pharmaceutical company over the summer for 40 hours a week when I was 16, which fun. That's not how most high school students want to spend their summer, but I enjoyed it. But I just remember sitting indoors in the lab, pipetting and being like, I like this, but I'd also like an outdoor component to it. So that's why, I think geology and marine science sort of, fit the bill. So I ended up majoring in geology and minoring in marine science. So I did my marine ecology and marine biology and geosciences, which I loved. And I had great professors at University of North Carolina. And I ended up kind of combining all of these things into studying fossil clamshells and studying their geochemistry. So I got the animals, I got the fossils, I got the chemistry and the geology, like all in one.
That's a path many of us would just intuitively follow.
Yeah.
So I want to ask, so is it the geochemistry that comes first, and then you're looking for something, every geochemist needs like a target of interest,
right?
Target of opportunity, and or what?
How that happened? Yeah, it was just. I think it was just kind of a lot of us. We end up doing what our supervisors or a professor kind of tells us about. And so my advisor was this great man named Drew Coleman at UNC, and he is a isotope specialist, and he used strontium isotopes. And the first project he let me work in his lab. It was like my first labby science job that I got, which was great. I couldn't believe I was actually working at a lab, and he let me look at stone tools and studying the strontium isotope composition, so then you can actually find out where they're from, and then you can learn about the archaeology and the history of where these tools are from, and you can also do the same thing with teeth, looking at human migration. And I think I just liked that geochemistry gave you this opportunity to tell a great story about something, and about anything. It can be about your food, it can be about migration and humans and animals and fossils. And I just thought that was so fascinating.
Gives you an opportunity to tell a story.
Yeah, I thought that was great.
What do you mean?
That it's not just like, here's some results or here's a DNA sequence. I can build a story around what happened in the life. Like there was a life that was associated with what I was studying, and it was like maybe a clam that lived 3 million years ago, and I could trace the Gulf Stream. Or, it was a person that lived in the Middle East, 20,000 years ago, and I can see where they moved from and where they ended up, dying. And I just thought that was so fascinating.
Yeah, that is the essence of science, isn't
Yeah.
it? Telling a story about something based on, hopefully, some data.
Yeah, something small.
So this, you're a black box paleontologist? You're confined to the lab? Do you get out of the house?
Yes.
Where has this taken you?
Well, yeah, so, leaving UNC, I decided I was going to go to graduate school just because that's what you do when you like school. You're going to go to grad school. And I heard about this brand new program. This was 2008, the American Museum of Natural History, through just a lucky email that I made to one of the curators there, who happened to be the dean of the graduate school, who, spoiler alert, later became one of my PhD supervisors, who said, oh, there's this great new program we're starting. No one's done it before, but it's going to be great. So I said, I'm going to apply. And this was back in the day when you had to like jam it all into an envelope and put it in the mailbox 11 years ago. It wasn't even online. So I was so excited. I sat down that afternoon, wrote my essay, and I said, I'm going to go to New York City and I'm going to study, I thought maybe, some invertebrates, clams, some shell thing, something shelly, I guess I thought. And then
I'm really feeling the passion.
Yeah,
here.
well, right. I wasn't super passionate about it. I was like, this is interesting and I like this technique. But then in the interim, I started reading like, oh, well, you can do this on vertebrate teeth too, these geochemical techniques. And not many people at that time had tried to do it on dinosaurs at all, which is cool. I heard there's lots of dinosaurs at AMNH, much like Brian. I grew up about an hour away, and I would come here for school trips and visit, and we had a great time. So I thought, yeah, they got a little more excited about that. And so when I got to the museum to interview, and I said I would do shells, but I was like, but could I do something else? And they're like, you can do whatever you want. If you figure it out, you can do it. And they gave me this tremendous freedom and, great collections to work with and great people to work with, and just let me do whatever I wanted to do.
So while she's working on her PhD, not chronologically, because you're a little separated in age, I think.
Different.
We
time
actually
period.
met 10 years ago at the museum.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, you were there
When I was in grad school.
sharing egg fossils. What were you doing?
I think it was like for a preview of a dinosaur exhibit.
Yeah, it was a preview of a new
okay.
exhibit that was opening, and we met. And he was
So,
like,
so
It
were you
must have
there
been
to
like
cover?
right
Were you there to
before I
cover?
moved, like the last
Yep.
week in New Jersey before I headed out.
Were you there to
west.
cover the exhibit or just to gawk?
I mean, both, really. I mean, that's the point of the career, right? Is
Yeah.
that there's something I love and that I'm passionate about, and someone will pay me to gawk at fossils and tell other people why
Well,
they should too.
No, I think that's an important thing. Both of you've got a passion for something. In your case, it's a at this stage technical adventure that you're on. You have I think a more emotional relationship with your interest. It's arising out of a thing that you've cared about since childhood. But you both have found a way to make your obsession pay in a literary way, and I want to sort of pivot a little bit to that. I want to know a little bit more, Brian, about how you actually did something very interesting from a kind of science writing, journalistic standpoint that wasn't possible until relatively recently. You kind of constructed yourself out of little bits and pieces of fossilized online media. Yeah. So you want to tell us a little bit about how this worked?
Yeah, there's a phrase called "fake it till you make it." That's kind of secret. But I want to go back to something that Shaena said not so long ago. A lot of it comes down to questions, and it was the same thing for me. Even if I was coming from a more, as you put it, emotional place, or the sort of visceral, fascination and love for these creatures, and that's where it started. So much of what I do, it's still those questions, whether I'm out in the field or whether I'm picking something to write about. It's like, well, wait, like, how does that work? Or where does this fit in? Or how did this animal move? Or what did it look like? Or whatever. All those things are basically the basis of not only science, but science communication. That's where the stories come from. And for my own part, the way that I cobbled this together, I mentioned a couple moments ago that I started at a website called Think Progress, and when that scholarship contest ended, it's like, I like this, I'm going to keep going. It wasn't anything that I really thought about as a profession. per se, because before initially it was you can't study dinosaurs, and then I was like, well, how are you going to make a living as a writer? And my parents were so supportive of everything that I did. But I kept at it because I loved it. So I moved over to WordPress, and at that time, and we were talking a little bit about this before the session started, back in the olden days, there was this magazine called Seed, and it's not around anymore. And Seed had this website called scienceblogs.com, and they were collating blogs about science. And meanwhile, like in the mainstream, blogs are already starting to give way to Facebook and other forms of social media. But scientists and science writers and people who love science were really starting to glom onto blogs as a place to share what you knew, what you thought about, what you were passionate about. There's comment sections where everybody could interact. You'd have these blog rolls where you could like basically link to other people that you liked. There's this whole online community, and I really wanted to be a part of that. And after about 9 months of blogging on my own, I got asked to jump over to science blogs, which I did. And then about a year after that, Smithsonian wanted me to start a blog for them called Dinosaur Tracking. And it was around this time, and I knew I wanted to write a book as well. This was all going to culminate in something, which became Written in Stone, which came out in 2010. And that was one of those, like, I'm just going to write this book and figure out where the hell it's going to go. I just need to do this. And then, sporadic, very, very low paying work. I think at the time, science blogs had a policy, every like 10,000 page views, you got like $25. It's like, hooray, I can drive to my day job today.
Right. But your day job was what?
I worked at Rutgers University for something called the IR4 project. So I oversaw a database of biopesticides. Okay. So if a farmer had, worms on his corn, there'd be an alternative that wasn't as toxic as like Roundup or something.
So if I may say, this is a classic day job.
Yes.
This is okay. No, it's just paying the rent. It's paying.
Oh, absolutely.
And in the dark of the night where enthusiasms boil and bubble, you're
blogging.
You're blogging, right?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Because it's interesting because I recall how you sort of became like a person as a science writer, and you did invent yourself, if I may put it that way. Yeah. There was no particular ladder that you sort of, I got a job as at the New Jersey fill in the blank, and then I did that for a while, and then I did this, and then No, you just sort of put yourself out there and started sort of doing it.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like I educated myself largely, and I developed expertise, and that led me to researchers and experts that I talked to and I learned from, and doing field work and volunteering at the time New Jersey State Museum gave me some more experience. So it started to build on itself. It's like, wait, this is maybe a viable career option. And it took years, so I want to point out that I started this about 14 years ago. I've only been professionally writing as a full-time freelancer for about 9 years. So it took me quite a while to actually build this up. And if I had the intent of doing it, maybe I would have done some things differently or would have gone faster. But it was always like, I'm just going to do this because I like it. And that's okay, there's a little bit of money in this. And then in terms of my schooling, I really wanted to do what you do. I wanted to be a professional paleontologist.
This is the curious thing about the two of you are kind of in the mirror, and the mirror, of course, keeps warping. But
right. But my average at Rutgers was not very good. I had Chemistry 101 and Physics 101 left. And so I'm at a community college trying to fulfill my last requirements. Meanwhile, I'm blogging for Smithsonian. I'm writing pieces for the Times of London. My first book is coming out that gets like a star review in Publishers Weekly. It's like, I can struggle in school and maybe eke out a position in somebody's lab, or I can try and be a writer. And that's the path that I ended up taking. So, like you said, I didn't do it with the intent of inventing myself, but it was just this thread that I started pulling at and kept going with, and it's led me where I am now. And I want to just mention this part of it. It's like, it's still pulling at the thread. It's still very month to month because I make my living as a freelancer. I don't have a staff job. I don't have really income that I can really count on, and that's part of freelance life. It's like you're never quite sure where the next meal is going to come from.
And we're going to talk some more about that. For both of you, got that in common now. But I want to just, and then I want to, sure. But was there a particular moment for you where you, came home from your rewarding work doing database custodial work, and you thought, as you sat down to your blog or whatever, I could do this?
Yeah, so there was that moment, but it wasn't at home, and it wasn't necessarily to do with writing. So in 2009, my former partner proposed a trip out west that we'd fly to Salt Lake City, we'd spend 2 weeks going up through Utah, Yellowstone, down back around, really exploring the West, because I'd never been there at all. I'd spent my whole life in New Jersey, the annual family trip to Disney World. You know, the closest I got to dinosaurs were the animatronics and the Exxon World of Energy exhibit. And it was about the second day, and we're at Dinosaur National Monument in Utah, right on the Utah-Colorado border. Famous Jurassic Age site with all the classic Stegosaurus, Allosaurus, Diplodocus, all those. The campsite that we're at, you have the Green River in front of us, this Permian outcrop, this basically sawtooth formation of rock. And you know, I'm looking up at the stars, it's dark, and there's this cloud. I'm like, what is that? It's the Milky Way. I'd never seen it before my entire life because I lived in New Jersey. You know, maybe like on a good day we get Orion, but that's about it. But being out there seeing, you know, being in nature, seeing the cottonwood trees, seeing the stars, seeing that geologic time there, and how much I wanted to explore still and write about that, and like felt that this was something that was pulling at me to follow. That's like, I got to move out here. I got to do this. This is what I need to do. So I knew I was going to keep writing no matter what, but that was the moment that really made me take that jump and say, okay, I'm going to move to Utah and make this my life's work.
Okay. Shaena, while Brian's holding down a day job he doesn't like very much, you were really burning up the track, if I may say so, as a researcher, as someone who's making a career as a young scientist in paleontology. You're off to the Gobi Desert, you're doing all the kind of cool stuff that field workers get to do. You're winning a series of very prestigious research fellowships. I mean, you're really doing well. So what was the reason for your own pivot, if I may put it that way?
So what happened? Yeah.
What happened to
Yeah.
Dr. Montanari that she's now wants to be a scribe?
Interesting. Yeah, it is interesting. I guess, as I alluded to before, I like too many things, you know, and it wasn't even just within science. I mean, I was just one of those people who just loved learning and kind of excelled in everything learning wise, not like sports or anything athletic. Mostly sitting inside and reading and drawing things was my forte. I wasn't actually, I mean, I liked outdoorsy nature things, so I wasn't even really super outdoorsy. I just really liked learning and reading. But like you said, you kind of just did what you liked to do. And I think that's always been motivating me. And I think that my preferences and my motivations have changed over time too, which is fine. You know, the track that I think it's important for me to remember my journey is interesting and a little bit different than a lot of people's in a way, because I started undergrad when I was 17 and I graduated in 3 years. I've graduated at 20 and I got my PhD at 24. And so now I'm 31, not under 30 anymore. And so that, I mean, so 20, the person you are at 24 to 31, there's a big difference there. I mean, you know, I did most of my started to mature as an adult on my own in New York City and getting my PhD. So it was just, and I loved it and it was fascinating, but I hadn't really taken any time to figure out what is like the mark that I want to make on the world, and you know, thinking of like in big strokes. And I think starting in research was a great way for me to start, and I'm so glad I have that background. And I think a lot of the reason I'm so interested in science communication is because of where I ended up doing my PhD at the American Museum of Natural History, because I did so many forward-facing activities and talking to trustees and talking to media and talking to students and high school students and just like these diverse groups of people that really, you know, that was really intoxicating, and I loved that. And I was like, how can I do more of this? And so, you know, I just liked the kind of fast pace of that as maybe opposed to research. I mean, you know, and I, instead of viewing it as, it is a pivot, you know, I did research for a decade and had some publications, and I think I hopefully made some good contributions, and, you know, maybe much like Brian, create your own path. Like, you know, I don't necessarily have to leave that behind now that I've pivoted more towards, you know, writing and communication. I don't have to completely leave it in the dust and pretend that it never happened. You know, I think that I've built not just the skills, but And just doing something like this is like having the ability to talk to people. I can do it through the lens of paleontology, which is really fascinating to me.
Yeah,
So-
if I may
Go
real
ahead,
quick,
please, go
just,
ahead.
I would think that, and please tell me if I'm wrong, that like the science that we're both involved in, that you do, there are preconditions in which you learn whether you've got a knack for communicating or not, because you're always, whether it's writing grants or like you said, talking to trustees, or I imagine there must have been like interview requests about your research, or whatever it is. Some of our colleagues or people that I interview or work with, I'm sure we wish we'd be better at communicating, but if you have a knack for it, I think paleontology or many sciences, like it lets you discover that and gives you like pathways to explore it.
Oh yeah, I definitely agree that just people want to know about dinosaurs, and then you can subtly start teaching them about other things. But yeah, they just want to know. So it's a great way.
Subtly teach them other things. I'm going to digress for a minute
Yeah.
and ask you both about this. I mean, there is this. It is a phenomenon, and we can kind of scratch our heads as to why this might be true. It's the stuff of, I think, child psychology and who knows what. But it's just a fact that it's a non-polarizing topic. It's a kind of shared affection for these creatures of our past and of our imagination. And so what I guess I'm wondering about, so when the two of you are sitting down to sort of, write your books or do your podcast scripts, or I'm trying to remember is it Dinosaur Doctors?
Oh yeah, that was another thing.
A wonderful hospital-based thing that you set up. Well, anyway, when you're doing these nice kind of cheery, we're all on the same page here, stories about dinosaurs and such, I'm wondering, how much are you thinking about the stealth aspects of this kind of narrative? I mean, this isn't just a story about the big lizard. This is also a story about climate change, and it's a story about the age of the Earth. It's a story about the pace of evolution. It's a story about a lot of things that if you phrase it quite a little bit differently in our contemporary realm, you'd get a really good bar fight going. And I'm wondering whether that's what you two are up to, each in your own way, or is it just a happy coincidence?
Well, I think there's always a push and a pull between these different interests. With any story that I tell, any paper that I pick out, I try and pick the bigger context. Like it could be very simple in terms of, has research been done on this animal before and now it's different than we thought it was? Is it a story about ecology or evolution, or how fossils are formed? What's the bigger picture beyond have we found something neat? But I think there's value also in using paleontology as a way to push a little bit, and I've done this in two instances, one of which involved you in the recent past. The most recent one was I wrote a piece for the Washington Post about how the shutdown affected paleontology. And it could be true for any science. Lots of scientists are government funded, work at the Smithsonian or other government institutions, had their work delayed, shut down, whatever it was. But just being able to use that tagline of, Trump is delaying the dinosaurs that you really want to see, gave me a hook to talk about this broader issue in a way that might have been more palatable or acceptable or interesting, or gotten people to look at it. When if it was just broader, it was like, this is harming science. Well, people who care about science will read it, but other than the scientists and science writers and stuff on Twitter, no one's going to look at it. And the other aspect was I did a piece last year about the issues that paleontology has with gender and representation that I talked to you about.
Wanted to talk about that.
Again, this is an issue that exists throughout science, unfortunately, and could be told about any number of sciences, but being able to talk about it in respect to a science that people are just naturally interested or naturally drawn to, I felt was a way to get at a bigger issue and telling the small story to get the bigger picture. Whereas if I made it more general and tried to narrow it down, it'd be an encyclopedia of terrible things. It's like, how do I actually get people to listen? And that was part of that strategy. So I think no matter what the story is, whether it's a new paper is out that I want to highlight a new fossil, or it's an issue, a broader issue, like something like climate change, like gender issues in science and research, the effects of government shutdowns on science, that paleontology gives us a way to kind of get our foot in the door and make people listen a little bit, and it's a happy coincidence that I'm fascinated by the science to start with. But yeah, that is one strategy that I definitely use.
There is a kind of a Barney effect.
A little bit.
Yeah. So for you, how would you answer that question?
Yeah, I think what interested me about paleontology, as I like described a little bit about my past, was just that you can tell these great stories. And so it wasn't necessarily like, oh, that it's about dinosaurs, but again, it's a great coincidence that it's something I'm interested in and that people care about. And I specifically did focus a lot on looking at past environmental changes. And so it's a way to show like, hey, when the environment changed in the past, this is what happened. And people generally won't deny that when you're showing them the research, and they'll go, and some people will say, oh, so you're saying that the environment did change in the past, so that means we're not causing it. And it was like, no, that's not what I said. It means it did change in the past, yes. And we know that because we are geologists. It's not a surprise when you say that to me. I do know. And this is what happened. Like, look what happened to all these animals. Like, look how, mass extinctions happen. Like, now, I can sort of subtly show that. And people do, even people who might be more skeptical of, things like climate change read that and they go, oh, that's interesting. And then when they kind of realize what it's really saying, they're like, wait a minute, what? You kind of like sometimes can trick people into actually seeing what happens when the climate changes, through looking at paleontology in a detailed way, which I just think is really fascinating.
And I think part of the advantage of paleontology is that it exists at the juncture of a lot of different sciences. Like, there are some people who are experts in paleosols, so paleosoils, and that's their whole career, or paleoclimatology, or it takes a physics approach to biomechanics, or paleochemistry, or zoology, so that really, like, to understand the prehistoric world, you need a whole world of sciences, and you can approach it from all these different angles that are brought in. So it gives us a lot of flexibility, I think, in the stories that we tell, because it's not just about the animals, it's not just about evolution or extinction. You can teach physics with dinosaurs, you can teach chemistry with dinosaurs, climate change, disease, almost anything that you can name that affects life on Earth or nature as we know it, we can talk about in the context of the science.
I mean, even now, like computer science and math, even since we have these huge databases of like where fossils are found and how many fossils we have and diversity curves, like people learn to program looking at fossil record things that are now, that we've collected so much data, it's all on the computer.
Yeah, you just said something I want to make you to linger on for a second. So how do you see yourself in this? I mean, do you see yourself as an educator? You just talked about teaching. Your books, this book, very much a kind of, in a good way, in a good nonfiction bathtub read, curl up on the sofa sort of way. It's a tutorial about using bones as a lens to look at evolutionary biology of, in this case, our own. But so, are you an educator? Are you a journalist? Are you an entertainer? Are you a lobbyist for more science? I mean, what hat? What's your hat?
That's a good question, and I think it keeps changing for me. As if I'm operating now as a policy fellow, not a lobbyist, because I'm at the government, but as a policy fellow,
surely you're talking to a lot of Congress people about what a great idea it is to spend more money on science.
Well, yeah, but working for,
which is a fine thing,
but working for the government. So you can't work for the government and also be a lobbyist at the same time. If you're like in an agency,
well, legally,
yeah. Well, I'm not getting,
anyway,
not getting paid by like big fossil.
But you see my.
Here's your 2 pennies.
Here, but yes.
No, but you know what I mean.
But yes, in every, if I call myself a paleontologist, if I call myself a writer, if I call myself, I've been a teaching fellow, if I call myself a policy fellow, in all of the depending on whatever my job title is, I am trying to educate and tell people how important science is in every one of those at the root of it. So I guess my label is whatever job I'm holding at the current moment, I suppose.
I was thinking of this more as a matter of temperament and the way that your intellect bends, as opposed to your job title.
I mean, I think my intellect will always bend as a scientist. Oh, like as a paleontologist, as a scientist always. But I think that is useful, because we need scientists. I mean, then we need people like Brian, as you said, we're like looking in a mirror, we're similar but different, kind of looking in different ways. And I think having people like Brian is so important because you do more field work than I do. And so paleontology is also great because it kind of shows that like anyone can get involved, and we all work together as a community of experts. Like it doesn't matter if you have your PhD in paleontology, or if you graduated high school and you've been looking at, there are people who've been looking and studying fossils in their region since they were 5 years old and been doing it for 5 decades.
Yeah.
And,
NYU,
so,
as it happens, in addition to training the Science, Health, and Environmental Reporting program, also trains a lot of scientists who want to reach out to the public, who want to write. And there's a wonderful set of writing workshops for PhDs and postdocs. And I guess what I was wondering about from that standpoint, it's your specialty, it's your training that gives you authority to write, that gives you standing. Whereas with someone like Brian or myself, it's our curiosity that gives us standing. Now, obviously, there's overlap. But, so how would you answer that question? Are you an educator? Are you a serial explainer? Are you, do you consider yourself a journalist?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a difference between what is my career and what is the inspiration for that career. My career is as a journalist and as a writer, and when I'm writing for places like the Washington Post or the Smithsonian or blogging at Scientific American, I'm trying to think, have that journalist hat on, think, okay, like, what are my sources for this? What do I think about this? Am I representing this, accurately and fairly, bringing up, issues that might exist, with the way that the science was done or communicated or whatever it is. Like I kind of made some of my name by being a pain in the ass when studies would come out that, like the Triassic Kraken was my favorite one.
I'm sorry, the what?
The Triassic Kraken. So this was during the Geological Society of America.
I think we'd all like to hear about the Triassic Kraken.
Yeah, I mean, it's a great breakfast cereal. It's very sugar.
Right. So it's got a lot of sugar in it, though. I think I won't feed it to my kids. But
so during, I think it was the Geological Society of America conference, they pick a number of abstracts out of the conference to communicate, and they don't get an outside perspective or peer review. This is just someone's presenting something as a poster or as a presentation, and they'll make a press release about it. So there's this idea, there's this whole graveyard of giant fish lizards, whale-sized fish lizards called ichthyosaurs out in Nevada, and they're all deposited there by this previously unknown giant squid that was drowning them and dragging them to the depths. And it's kind of, very, 20,000 leagues under the sea. There's a great, big, decaying graveyard of fish lizards. There's no evidence for it whatsoever. It was really bad science, but a lot of places, including places that a lot of people turn to for their science news, like Live Science, picked it up. And I kind of felt it, was my duty as a, someone in a SNIT who loves fossils to go on my blog on Wired and say, like, no, this is actually bad science, and this is being communicated poorly, and this is harmful because it's making it sound like science is done by fiat. Scientist A just says something, we're like, oh, okay, cool, and then we move on. And that's kind of, especially early on, a number of these, big media events would happen that were not what they turned out to be. A fossil called Darwinius that was supposed to be a human ancestor turns out to be a lemur cousin, was another example of this. But in those moments, I was passionate about it, but I tried to be careful and think and act with my journalist hat on. And am I doing this correctly? But the reason that I'm doing this as a career is because I want those I didn't know that moments. I mean, that's what Skeleton Keys was about. That was what drew me to a lot of my passion for dinosaurs and other fossils, things that were relatively familiar, but when you start to get deeper and deeper into that, it's like, I had no idea that there are these connections, or that the science was used to these particular political ends, like in particular, some of the things I talk about in Skeleton Keys with human remains and the ways that they fueled scientific racism and other issues that we're still dealing with now. But all these, those I didn't know that moments are the stuff that allows me to have my career. And so I'd say, yeah, I'm a journalist and I'm a writer, but the basis for what I do in terms of why I write and why I go out in the field and do what I do, it's just that sense of curiosity that you mentioned earlier.
So I'm curious now, because he brought something up that I think lurks in the background here. Real science journalists, are off chasing gravitational waves and things like that, and ocean warming, and the dinosaur just is a kind of the discovery story, right? When it's August and things are slow. I'm talking sort of mainstream, online and such media. It's a great sort of pop, gee whiz story. Do you think that it's, from your standpoint as a paleontologist turned communicator, that science journalists are kind of a little gullible about these stories of discovery because they don't actually take them very seriously. I mean, there's sort of like a summer silly story. Oh, look, here's the biggest, what was it, Triassic Kraken?
The Triassic
Kraken.
Kraken.
Triassic
Yeah, I
Kraken,
remember
sorry.
that.
Yeah.
Oh, we have the
Look at
dinosaurs
that. Here's
tomorrow.
the biggest, the story's always about the biggest brachiosaur ever found in South America. It stretches from Buenos Aires all the way up to Mexico City. You know, I mean, and that's it. Boom. You know, paleontologist makes claim. Stenographic science writer duly writes it down. There's a really cool artist conception. It runs. You know, everybody goes home. Do you think we're gullible?
No, I don't think it's gullible. I think that's just sort of the landscape that a lot of journalism operates in now. It's just like a lot of fast and quick stories. And it's like you said, you know, when a new study comes out as science journalists, you know, you get your embargoed papers for the week and there's a study and you generally are going to write about that one study. And sometimes it turns out after further review that it might not have been the original story you published, which is fine because that's the way science works. I think publishing a story or writing a journalistic story from the standpoint of an abstract at a conference is difficult because it's not peer reviewed, which is, I think, at least as a journalist, if you know you're looking at a peer reviewed paper, you have a little bit of like, oh, well, other scientists have at least looked at this and said that it's like okay to go out right now. But, you know, and I just know that when, you know, a cool story comes out and then a lot of other outlets pile on because they also want to have the cool story. And then, but then you do know, I think when you know about it, and like I've had this when I wrote more at Forbes, when you were able to say, oh, actually, no, this is not what's happening, then you created your own news story.
We love to say,
people
well,
like, well, actually.
Well, actually,
and but
yeah.
those are always like the most popular stories that I've written, or like well, actually, what the story you've seen 11 times today might not actually be the whole story. So, and I think that happens a lot with paleontology, at least because, you know, if there's and sometimes the source of the story can be dubious, even if it's not from. It can be like from a photo, or you know, something that someone saw online, and then like somehow a story gets spun out of it. So I don't think it's gullible. I think it's just I think there's so much to know that, and just like on a time crunch, sometimes you know, and there's a cool picture associated with it. You want to run with it, and it's might be hard to gather all the information.
Okay. So I want to take a question here.
Sure. So this question is actually from the internet, but someone would like to ask Shaena, how does the way she does SciComm and what she talks about change depending on which platform she's using, and how would you say that's different from a journalist writing about a study?
Oh, interesting. Like different platform, like social media. I'm assuming,
yeah.
Right? That's really a good point. I think I'm still probably more finding my voice as a journalist, as I think online. If anyone follows me on Twitter, I'm sorry. 1, 2, but like I think I'm more
Is it at Dr. Shaena?
It is,
Yeah.
yes. Don't follow me. But no, I think I don't follow me. But I think I'm more myself online, and like I'm
and
more
you are what?
comfortable.
That's your
Laylabs.
It
is Laylabs,
Yes.
Yeah,
Sorry.
you know, trying to use humor and be funny and be myself, and I don't think I do that as much maybe in my, you know, if I'm trying to be a serious science journalist. And as you said, it's something I've come to, you know, I've come to in the past few years, and so I'm still, you know, more learning about science writing and journalism. And so, you know, and also the place, it depends what you're writing for. You know, I did a fellowship, as you mentioned, at National Geographic.
Right.
You can only include so many ha-has in a National Geographic article. Like I got a couple puns, but
You save
very
it for the
mild,
kicker.
mild puns. Yeah, good kicker, a funny lead, you know, a good subhead that's like a movie quote that no one gets except you and 3 of your friends. You know, like that's kind of stuff like that's how. But I think, you know, as I hopefully find my voice as a writer and telling more stories, that I can be more. Because I think what you know sets some of us apart is this, like, I think I'm funny, so I like to try to be funny on social media. But you know, I think the more personality you bring to your writing, even for the public, I think the more successful you'll be.
So I want to ask you,
Yeah.
I think just to explore this, that's a good question, and I want to bring you into it.
Yeah.
So how many different platforms do you work on? So Twitter, what else? Instagram,
Yeah, I'm
Facebook,
a little bit of like for my professional
Snapchat,
setting is really Instagram and Twitter would be
Instagram
my
and Twitter.
Twitter's my big one though.
Okay, so I think the question is, do you do different kinds of stories or different kinds of, I mean, you can't call something on Twitter a story, so news nuggets?
Yeah.
depending on what the platform is, and then I want you to think about it because I'm going to ask you the same question.
Oh yeah, I think I do. I think, as I said, Twitter is my primary vehicle
Sure.
for educating people online. So I do try to use more humor and like
All right.
pictures and things like that. But yeah, as opposed, I mean, in Instagram too, I think I do something. I do similar things, but I think you can be more visually motivated.
Okay,
which is
well,
fun.
so let me ask the question
Yeah.
this way. All right, so Brian, what's a good Twitter story, and what's a good Instagram story? What's the difference? Or a Facebook story? I mean, pick your platform. Is there a difference? Besides kind of length and one gets a picture? I guess they all get pictures now. There's convergence. But
Yeah.
Whatever gets past the algorithm at this point.
Yeah.
So, I mean, that's one of the issues that we're having with social media now. So, like I was mentioning earlier, how when I started, science blogs was the big game in town, and blogging about science in general. You had, your article that you wrote about, and you could be, humorous or personal. It was a blank page. Like Carl Zimmer often talked about this in these talks. Like, it was like a blank sheet of paper. And then you had the comment section or your blog roll, and that's where the conversation was. Since then, the conversation has moved to all these different social media platforms. Twitter, Facebook, Snapchat, Instagram, and they all have their own strengths and weaknesses, but the one common thing tying them together is that they, especially since the rise of fake news and the various platforms, attempts to, deal with that by basically going like, anytime that you share a link that seems like it's advertising something or leading off the site, it ends up being suppressed. So the goal of many of these social media apps and platforms is to keep you inside of it. So it's not even necessarily what makes a good Twitter story. It's like, how am I using this tool to tell that story? In most cases now, it's like you share an image. Maybe you can add a hashtag to it if it's something that's going to be told over time. But it's very bite-sized, it's very visual, and it's something that needs to catch the eye of the person as they're scrolling through. Because it's, the stats for this are pretty consistent. Like, I went back in this past week and looked at some of my most popular tweets, some of my most popular Facebook posts. It's like 1% engagement. So what that means is that people are basically scrolling through and they see something, they're like, that's cool, and they go to the next thing. They're not clicking through to read the article. So for a while it was, blogs were everything, and then you had the blog, and then you had the platform to promote it. But now most of the conversation is happening on those platforms that used to just do for promotion. So it's becoming much shorter, much more bite-sized. This was, I don't hear people talking about it as much anymore, but that website, I Often Love Science, that they really capitalize on this, like by here's just a snapshot of like 4 things that are really cool this week, and keeping people in it. So like as a science journalist, a science writer, a science storyteller, or communicator, the landscape is constantly shifting underneath our feet, and I don't think anybody entirely knows what's going to be effective, that we're all just trying different stuff, but whatever the next thing is, we're still kind of waiting for.
Do you have anything you want to add to that?
No, I think that's great. I think that's really true, because sometimes you'll post something and the link will be retweeted hundreds of times, but you realize like no one actually clicked on the link when you go look at the stats. Yeah. So I think what I enjoy, at least from a lot of science writers, is that when they write a story, if they can then do a little couple extra bits on Twitter, I think of what's not in the article is more popular and like more responded to for me than people responding to what I wrote.
It's a tricky question. You could have alluded to this, because I mean, really, at the end, it's like you want to ask, well, okay, how do you monetize this? And by monetize, I don't necessarily mean get a buck out of it, but how do you capture the attention? So if I do what you suggest, and I take something neat from my story, and that's my notes, that's not in my story, and I put it in Twitter to tease a link to my story, well, like Brian, I know that actually nobody on Twitter ever clicks on a link. And of course the apps are designed to make it hard to do that anyway.
Right.
And they want to capture you and keep you for their own purposes. So what's this doing for us as science writers, as science journalists? I mean, it's doing something, but what?
I think it's creating a personal brand at that point. I mean, because they're seeing, what you have to say just without even reading your article. So they want to know. I think a lot of it's curiosity, wanting to know more about you and your outlook on your, like, maybe even a little bit of like interjecting some of what you thought about something you saw. And so I think it's a brand. It's definitely a personal personal branding, but it is, becomes a brand.
So you're really kind of talking about Twitter here? Is this
Yeah, that's
all
just
right, so
primarily
is
what I
personal
use.
branding,
Yeah.
okay. Are you branding yourself for readers, or are you branding yourself for freelance editors?
Oh, I think just readers. I don't think that editors are paying attention to me.
Well, I think in some ways, particularly on Twitter, it's kind of like, scientists are on Twitter, journalists are on Twitter, and we're telling each other how important Twitter is, but the audience has largely moved elsewhere.
Yeah, that's true.
And that's kind of a problem. And
Yeah.
that's one of the reasons that I wanted to bring up the work that you've done in hospitals and some of the other outreach, because I've been seeing more
Please.
scientists and science communicators and other people basically almost going out analog, where people are getting booths at Comic-Cons or different conventions for their museum or for their research, or basically literally meeting people where they are at, because so many people are, like, it's hard to know where the audience is with social media, and from the stats that we've seen, like, most apps seem to be basically tapped out. Like, basically all the people are going to use Twitter or Facebook.
Yeah.
It's relatively stagnant right now, and I've seen more and more people involved with science, like, going to find people in the physical world, or find crossover fandoms, or find ways to get to other people, because otherwise we're basically, it's like, the drying pond in the African savannah, where it's getting smaller and smaller. So I'm like, we're gonna come back, it's
More
fine,
and more
it's
elephants,
fine.
all- yeah.
And then all of a sudden you're a skeleton bleaching in the sun. So we're trying to find where people are at, and I think part of that is literally going to see people.
No, I think that's important. Yeah, it's what I'm saying. That's why I was saying social media is more for personal branding than anything else, because it's really just like people, if they're gonna come, it's just because they want to talk to you. It's not because like it's a great medium to like meet new audiences. It's like they think you're fun, or they like what you write, so they'll come check on you on Instagram or Facebook, on Twitter. But yeah, I think going out, like you said, Comic-Con, South by Southwest, like these, we're trying to like really reach out and hit new venues of where we can tap.
If I
into
could just
science.
pursue this thread for a second, I appreciate your patience. So this is interesting. Obviously, we here believe there's a value to the authenticity of personal presence. That's why you're here.
Right.
As opposed to being Skyped, which I guess we could do. It seems that many media outlets, and this is becoming like part of the biz in a way that it wasn't even 10 years ago. Everybody has a conference. You, I think, were brought into Caveat by our good friend Ben Lilly up the street.
Yes.
So that this is now part of the journalism, the personal appearance thing.
It
I mean,
is.
is that, do you agree with that? Is that your experience?
I haven't experienced it as much directly, but I think it is part of the changing media landscape, and it's even in the virtual realm as well. Like, we have resources like the Open Notebook, where we talk about and that's mostly for people who are already involved in science journalism or journalism in a broader sense, but wanting to get the behind-the-scenes stories and know how people do what they do in the personal side of this, because we're adding our expertise and our perspective, even when we're acting objectively and asking, okay, am I talking to the people I should be? Am I doing my due diligence in terms of research? Am I giving am I representing this like fairly and accurately? We're still telling it through our own personal lens, and that's becoming, I think, more and more a part of the story. And whether it's in formats like this, or whether it's on Twitter, or an interview for something else, I think that's becoming more and more prevalent, and that holds some appeal to draw more people in, because that's always the question. It's the push and the pull. Like I write something for Smithsonian. People who already are interested in nature and science and fossils and stuff are already reading that. How do I break outside of that into the broader conversation, especially as the landscape gets more and more and more fragmented? And I think this is a time of experimentation. We're all trying different things and going to see what sticks.
Yeah.
Give a question, please.
Yes. Speaking of things that stick, you mentioned earlier that you are conscious of the algorithms that bring stories to top on social media of different kinds. So I was wondering if you take those algorithms into consideration even before you post on social media, in terms of what you're going to post or what you're going to write about over there.
Yeah. Are you writing for the AI?
Okay.
Or are you writing for us?
I mean,
Brian?
I'll jump in first. I'm primarily writing for myself. Like I said, the things like I didn't know that, or this is really cool, the things that make me like, oh, I want to read that paper right now. But in terms of how I promote that or how I share that, oftentimes it's come down to taking an image or a photo, especially on Facebook, and making that the post, and then including a link in it, but Facebook or whatever social media app it is will read that as a photo rather than a link, so it'll be much more likely to get past that first bar. And then I'll reply to my own tweet or my own post, even just something like 2 little colons that says like bump, or like for the morning crowd or whatever it is, that gives it that extra visibility or brings it back to the top of people's feeds. So there are ways to sort of game the system right now. So I'm not writing for the AI, but at least in trying to get out like what I'm doing, I try and be very conscious of how that works and how I can get around some of those barriers.
Shaena, how friendly are you with the algorithm?
It's interesting because sometimes maybe it's just become part of me now. I'll think of something and I'll be like, that's gonna get a lot of likes. And I'll be like, and so I feel like I've gotten to the point where I can like predict, what's gonna, like just predict what's gonna rise to the top, either sometimes because of a hashtag, sometimes because of the image. If I find a really good image, I'm like, oh, this is like Twitter fodder, like people are gonna love this. But also because it's cool, so it's not, it's partially manipulative, but also I think I'm like, well, I'll retweet it and they're gonna like it too. But you're right about the photo and the link thing, and with Facebook specifically, and Facebook changed, as we all know, their algorithm to not show as many videos and to not show as much from not friends and like companies that you follow, so then it stopped showing that. So then if anyone managed a company or a group Facebook page, noticed that your engagement fell way off last year, it was because of that. And I'm even working at National Geographic, we always did a text on screen video with everything, and now don't do those because they're just not promoted on Facebook anymore. So so that does change the kind of stories that might pass editorial snuff sometimes.
Yeah, I remember when I was blogging for National Geographic, I ran into something similar.
Sure.
Hi, Lee, first of all, congratulations on 100 speaking events. Halfway there.
Halfway, halfway. Thank you. Thank you for that. Halfway, yes. I have a long run in front of me, yeah. I'm just getting warmed up. Little throat clearing, just a little throat clearing.
And for Brian and Shaena, I hope nobody minds, straight up paleontology and evolution question, or a couple of them, if you don't mind. Mineral enriched hard parts have obviously evolved a number of different times, but has actual bone, what we would recognize as real bone, is it monophyletic? Has it only evolved once, or has it appeared more than once? And then I guess sort of the other question is, do you think bone was essentially was it an inescapable innovation? Were we inevitably going to develop bone in the course of evolution?
Skeleton Keys author.
I was going to say, I think I know what the guy who wrote this thing. But let's ask Brian.
As far as I know, or as far as my reading goes, bone itself, like the bones that we have, had a single origin, but there was a period of experimentation before that. So there was a precursor to bone called aspidin. The first time that I learned about this aspidin. So it blew my mind because it was described as an acellular bone tissue, and my brain went, this makes no sense. How can this be acellular? But what it meant was that the first bone, or the precursor of bone, was basically teeth, or very much like teeth. It was basically accreted and cemented on and built up, and it wasn't remodeling itself like our bones are constantly doing, even right now. That's one of my favorite little, I hear Vincent Price in my head whenever I think about, like, even now your bones are being eaten up and laid down and turned over. It's pretty great. I'm not sure that we know enough yet, because there are new papers about this every year, about the relationship of these sort of proto-vertebrates to each other, and the relationship between bones and teeth, and the fact that bone and teeth started out as this outer armor that got sunken in the skeleton. But in terms of the second question, whether bone was inevitable or not, I don't think that it was. It required some certain preconditions to exist. For example, basically the calcium stores, like basically minerals that were washed off the continents into the oceans to become available for skeletons to become mineralized. But even before that, even just in terms of natural selection and natural history, that the reason that we have our heads where they are and our spines are at our backs rather than our fronts or some other configuration, because these little squiggly protovertebrate things that lived back in the Cambrian, over 500 million years ago, back in this arthropod-dominated world, that everything was, it was like a John Carpenter movie, like The Thing. It's like everything's jointed legs and jaws and teeth and like grabbing parts and stuff like that. And these little soft, squiggly little things are kind of the evolutionary underdogs there. And for reasons that we don't totally understand yet, our protovertebrate ancestors survived, but it could have very easily just gone the other way, and they could have been snuffed out, and we could be, living, the world could be very much like, those 50s science fiction movies like Them, with like giant ants and stuff running around. So there is an aspect of contingency there. It used to be thought that there was a mass extinction that wiped away all the Cambrian weirdos, and that's what allowed, protofish and stuff to evolve. Turns out that's not the case anymore, that our, protovertebrate ancestors lived alongside all these oddballs and stuff that we love from the Burgess Shale. So the story's a bit more complex than we thought. But I mean, to me, that's what makes us unique and wonderful, and what makes life so fascinating. Is like, it didn't have to be like this. There's no destiny to it. So out of all the possibilities that there were, that we are sitting here at all with our spinal columns and 206 some odd skeletonized parts, that's pretty amazing by itself.
And how would you answer that question?
That was a good answer that you gave. I'm very impressed.
Because see, this is interesting. So you're the scientist,
Yeah.
so you're the one who actually knows something.
Yeah, no, he knows. No, he knows.
Brian just talked to a lot of people
That's
and is
what I would
repeating
say.
what he's learned.
No, he's doing great. I think I would just add that nothing's really evolutionarily inevitable. I think evolution is not directional, and it's just that the fact, like, I agree with what you said. There was nothing that said that we had to exist. So lucky us.
Yeah. No, but it is interesting. It's right. That was an example of the nature of authority in the public communications sphere.
Which is ridiculous, because he knows more about it now because he just wrote a book on it and
Indeed.
I did not.
Indeed.
So
Exactly. Yeah.
right now you have it
Yeah.
more up there than I do.
A bit, but I think in terms of being a writer, and this is my beat, this is what I write about, that I need to become an expert on, even if I'm not publishing papers or conducting research or know the technical techniques that you do. I need to know this backwards and forwards.
No, you do.
And that makes a difference in. So this is something I want to circle back to before that
Sure.
we're talking about in terms of even like pitching stories and what gets covered.
Yes.
So I think, and this exists for all science, so I'm not just, like playing the world's smallest violin saying poor me, but like I've, pitched articles about, things I think are really cool going on with the fossil record. So like life's recovery from the worst mass extinction of all time. I've been wanting to write a story about this for years, but every time I've taken it to various magazines, I get back, well, can you do something about T-Rex though? It's like, yeah, that's not the same. It's like, well, but fossils are all kind of the same, right? And I've had major journals or magazines say like, well, we did a fossil story 3 months ago, so we're not really due for another one. But the editor has a background in genetics, and there'll be 10 genetic stories in that time. And I think what people's backgrounds are, what their beats are, what they consider important, does influence the coverage that gets out there, the stories that get told, and sometimes it can be difficult when you have a certain beat or a certain expertise and you think something is really interesting or really important or deserves coverage, trying to sell that point to somebody, like from my perspective, to somebody who, let's say, has a background in astrophysics or in genetics or chemistry or something like that. It's like, in a way, that I need to convince the editors before I can convince the audience.
It's true. But then when you convince them, then everyone will probably love it.
Question here.
That was close to what I was trying to get at with my question, which is pretty much like, in science journalism, a lot of stories like really suck, like paleontology. I know, not like that they're bad, but just like in paleontology, like it's certainly not all dinosaurs. Like there's all sorts of like horrible problems out at the field sites with like sexual assault, harassment and things like that. And so in this changing age where we're all relying on just like our worst thoughts going on the internet at all times in tweet form or whatever, like how are you getting across the like actual impactful things that, people don't want to publish or they don't want you to write about, or even that like, my Twitter followers, like they're not going to retweet that tweet, or maybe they will, I don't know. So how would you deal with that? Like the tweet about the bad stories that aren't the like fun, wow, a new dinosaur story.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, just to speak to that, I don't want to take the mic for too long, but my own experience with that was, I'd seen out, at field sites or at scientific conferences or just the culture of paleontology itself, that how much is basically male and pale, and that there's a greater diversity in the field than is being represented. So I wanted to write a story about this, about paleontology's problem, not only with gender, but basically like broader culture outside of the same 6 people that we see on all the documentaries all the time. So I became, okay, where do I go with this? Not only what I feel that there's a story here, and I want to tell this story, but what can I do with it? So I went to Smithsonian because at the time, I was and I'm still doing regular work for them, but it was something I was doing regular news stories, and I had a good relationship with the editor there. And it was very casual. It wasn't like I needed to have like everything laid out and have the full pitch for it. It's like, hey, this is an idea I have. What do you think? And it was through developing that relationship that I was able to get it very quick. Yeah or nay. Thankfully, it was yes in this case, and then run with it. But a lot of this from a writer's perspective, from a journalist's perspective, it's knowing, okay, is there a story here? Who do I approach, and how do I do that? That there are multiple sort of locks that you pass through as you're developing a story like this. And it's relatively easy. I'm in the position, again, I've had this happen more than once, it keeps happening to me, where I'm going to quote somebody about something and they're in the audience. So years ago, I saw John Rennie here at a DC Science Writers Conference, and you pointed out that science writing, I'm not trying to denigrate our profession here at all, but it's the reality of it that to do it very basically, it's not necessarily very hard in that we get, and this is something that you mentioned before as well, you sign up for Eureka Alert, you sign up for Nature Alerts, whatever it is, every week you get a package of things that the journal is telling you are going to be important that have images that go with it. They tell you who to talk to. Usually, if you don't already know someone to talk to, you can look in the acknowledgments and look and see who was the editor or whatever it was. You look at the press release, you send the image along, you get comments from researcher A, researcher B, do the whole inverted pyramid thing. That's it. And that's sort of the bread and butter of this stuff. So doing anything beyond that, it takes a bit more planning. I think the analogy that you used, John, at the time was that it's like sports writing. Like everybody knows what the big game in town is going to be, that everybody's going to be covering. And that's the stuff that we see often, the 500-word news item. Here's the basic rundown of the latest Nature paper. But going beyond that, it takes, I think, a little bit more care and sometimes a little bit more finesse in figuring out where that story should go, and what editors, what kind of relationships that you have. Someone, especially if it's a sensitive story involving things like sexual harassment or discrimination in the field, they're going to do justice to the story, because you basically become a team with your editor. It's not just you on your own. You need their input and their support, more so than just like, okay, is this doing justice to what the paper said?
Okay. I want to ask Shaena, it's certainly the case, paleontology, as much as, if not more so, than many field-based sciences, has been not just dominated by men, but dominated by a certain kind of cowboy swagger thing. Some of it's like, PR theater, but it still speaks to a kind of a field truth behind. And so I'm curious, from your standpoint, as a young scientist who is both knowledgeable in this field and also attuned to the optics as a communicator, as paleontology has started to broaden, and I think it's only started, is that changing the story we're now able to see about our past? Is it changing the kinds of stories coming out of paleontology? Because the vision is broadened.
Right. Yeah, definitely. And I think talking about having more women in the field, and they've been there most of the time, I think is the thing that a lot of people didn't know or realize, is that they were there, just not getting coverage. And that we are, in graduate level, about half and half, women and men. So that's great. But also that we're increasing international diversity too. And I think showing that they're, especially writing stories about countries that we don't normally write about, because everything happens in Montana, and people think it's a, Jack Horner in Montana, and it's not. Like, there's so much more. And I think that does change, when we go to Antarctica, or we go to Brazil, or we go to China, or we go to, there's Egypt. We have great Egyptian female paleontologists who are winning awards through our professional society that have amazing stories. So I think it does change the story, because we're now opening up to a new history of the people doing paleontology, which is, not just your straight up maybe press release story, but I think it really adds to the richness that we see in the field.
Can we have a question in the shadow here?
Hey guys, this is really great. Really quick, I work at Live Science, so when you mentioned Live Science and the Kraken, I quickly looked it up, and we did cover it, but we did also interview 2 skeptical outside sources to put it in context, which brings me to my question. How often do you guys find yourselves like debunking things that other people maybe didn't quite accurately report and then go viral? Like how often, and what platforms do you use for that?
Okay, so just in response to the Kraken bit, yes, the story was updated, but I think the initial one didn't include those sources, and that was after some of the blog posts that I put up at Wired. But all the same, I appreciated that Live Science did so. I don't do quite as much of that anymore. Just I've seen a little bit less of it. If something, it really depends on the perspective. At least for me, my perspective as a writer, whereas previously, I was so excited and tuned into like any major paper coming out that some of these issues that I kind of went off about, like to the average member of the public, whether this fossil that looks like a lemur is a human ancestor or not, isn't exactly the most pressing issue of the day.
Yeah.
Now I try and cover things more positively, but like I'll mention, if I'm skeptical about something or unsure about something, oftentimes I'll, for example, go on my Scientific American blog and write about it. So there's a dinosaur that was announced just a couple of weeks ago from South America that had this beautiful reconstruction of all these forward-pointing like spikes. This was called a mohawk of spikes pointing forward. There was a skull and a single vertebra that was incomplete. So this reconstruction was, speculative, but like this whole idea that this dinosaur had this defensive structure and that's why it evolved and everything else is taking things a bit too far, and I mentioned that there because I had the leeway to. It might have not necessarily made the best news story, because sometimes when they take stories like that to an editor, they say like, well, if you don't think it's sound, then why we want to cover it? I actually just had that happen. There's a study in PNAS that came out a week or so ago about some of the earliest life, and that basically mobility amongst early life evolved much earlier than previously thought. And I went to get comments from researcher A, I went to get my outside sources, and the outside sources were basically like, this is nonsense, these aren't even real fossils.
Yeah.
So when I went back to my editor with that, it's like, okay, we'll kill the story. Like we could have done a story saying like, okay, there's this controversy and I've done that before, but in this case we decided not to cover it. So it's really kind of a judgment call, I think, in terms of.
Yeah.
So Shaena,
That's
do you
tough.
find yourself doing a lot of what I'll just call corrective stories?
Yeah, I
Or-
have in the past, and they've always been, popular, because then when I would do it more on Forbes when, I was writing sort of an expert blog, and so then you can kind of quickly, like without editorial control, be like, this isn't true. And I mean, and usually those are popular because people want the real story, I mean, just yesterday, the day before, there was a story that there was 3 cans of uranium ore in a Grand Canyon museum for 2 decades or something like that, and people were exposed to radiation. And then people kept re-reporting it, but then there was a story in The Verge that was like, wait a minute, let's actually examine, like, is this actually dangerous to be next to 3 buckets of rocks of uranium ore? Like, it's not raw, like weapons-grade uranium. So I think that one, I was interested to read that because I was getting caught up like, ooh, no, sounds dangerous, this sounds bad. But then I was like, no, like what's the, and I think a lot of people want to know like, what's the real story? And especially I think the more you see the same headline that's really sensational, the more I think you get like, I don't know, maybe I'll do a study. There's like, you get more skeptical as the more sensational headlines you see. So I think it is valuable. And I've actually kind of gone off on a tangent as a writer, because I was just trying to like flex my skills, and so I'm really interested in Instagram and social media and wellness trends. So I've started writing articles for other outlets about like, you see charcoal toothpaste advertised to you, is that actually healthy? Things like that. And I think people have a thirst for knowing like, okay, like what's the real story here? Because I keep seeing that this is good over and over again, uncritically, and I want to see a critical assessment of this.
Right, I think it comes up a lot more often with health and medicine stuff, because
Yeah.
that does about the go. It says I can drink 3 glasses of whiskey today, and that's good for me. And
Yeah.
so it's a more direct effect on people's health. But I think in terms of what we often write about in our wheelhouse, maybe it's different for you, but for me, if I do a correction, it's almost like, number one, is this getting like broad media play, and like I feel like it merits some sort of correction. Also, it sends some hits my way if I'm able to tell somebody else they're wrong, and that also feels good. But does it get at a broader point, like in talking about like uranium ore and like how it affects people? Like, would I be teaching somebody about how this stuff works and
Yeah.
how like people actually get radiation poisoning and stuff? So it's not just like
think so.
a correction to the specific, but it gets at something larger than that, and that can make a difference.
Yeah, with dinosaurs, it's usually not like life or death. So
So I want to ask a quiz. This is believe it or not, a craft. conversation. So I want to quickly ask each of you from your particular perspective, like how both of you are freelancers in a sense, and what does that landscape look like to you now? I mean, we've kind of touched on a lot of different things, you know, Twitter and blogs, but in terms of managing and creating like a work life, I just wonder, Shaena, how it works for you.
Right.
And then Brian, I'm going to ask you the same thing.
Well, I'm still sort of in the phase when Brian had the day job, so I do have a day job, so I don't have to worry about hustling as much. I mainly do it if if I deem myself having a great idea that everyone must know about. But I have got, but cobbling together a lot of these opportunities, I feel like there are a lot of part-time opportunities that I see keep poking up that are good, but it's hard to live like that because they take up a lot of time. And I mean, you can probably speak more to how feasible it is actually to survive like this. Because right now, like, I don't know, if I didn't have the day job, I don't know if
So when you say day job, you're talking about the,
I have a policy fellowship.
The fellowship.
Yeah.
Right, okay.
Which
Because in a
pays
weird
the
way,
bills.
grants and fellowships are to scientists as book contracts are to writers. I mean, they kind of enable but not enable, you know.
Right. Yeah. So that's like I actually do produce events, kind of like this, but for other scientists. So that pays like the bills. So I guess I can't speak as much to the opportunities, but I feel like there's a lot of opportunities, but fewer full-time ones, which makes life easier generally.
Brian, what does it look like to you?
Scary. So, I mean, I need to get a little bit personal for a second, but I mean, that's the way that these things are because it does hinge on some aspects of personal life. So, for example, I started my writing career shortly after I got married and my spouse, maintained a regular day job and health insurance and all that stuff. They recently left me this past November, so I've been on my own for the past few months, and that's very different to feel like I may soon lose my health insurance, or that's something that I need to pay for, that I don't have regular income coming in every 2 weeks, where before my freelancing income was kind of a supplement. And now it's basically what I'm relying upon, and I can't call the rental office and say like, oh no, this magazine owes me the amount for rent, just hold off for another week. It becomes more of a do or die situation. And I think in terms of the general landscape, it's become a little bit more difficult. So the phrase that I've heard over and over again is like, oh, I wish we could pay you more. And I'm not going to name names of publications at the moment because I still need to work. But the usual rate that I end up getting is about $250 for a news item, a reported news item. And out of that, keep in mind that I need to take about 25% out to pay my personal taxes. So anything that comes in for me, it's already a large chunk getting taken out. And even though I've written, this is my 5th book coming out now, it's a similar sort of thing where it's like I'm balancing the short term and the long term, where I'm doing news items, but I need to work at the book at the same time. And even though a book is a prestigious thing, it can lead to more work. And it sounds like, there's a really big advance. I'm thankful for what I'm able to bring in, but, let's say I get a book advance, as a for instance of like $30,000. The publisher says, I'm going to split that into 2 halves. So it'd be $15,000 at the outset and $15,000 when you finish it. My agent gets, a deserved cut of that, and then after that I take out taxes. So basically what I'm left over with, I need to use to support myself, to get research materials, to do travel. There are plenty of writers who are like, yeah, I've gotten into debt and run up my credit card because I need to finish the book for all the travel and research and stuff to finish the actual project. So, freelancing, it does depend a bit on your life situation, on whether you have someone who is, whether it's a roommate or a partner or a spouse or whoever it is who's helping support you with that stuff, where you're getting your health insurance from, all those things. And I feel like it has gotten a bit more difficult in the scientific realm, and that a lot of work that I used to get is becoming, going more to staff people, which is great if you're staff. But for me, there are plenty of editors that I've known at one publication, and they jump to another one and say, oh yeah, I'm going to get work from you when I go to this next one. And they say, actually, we don't have a freelance budget. Or places where I was making $500 an article a couple of years ago, that's $400, that's $350, that's we overran our budget for this month, so can you do $300? And I see this pop up now and again where science writers will say, or journalists will say, well, never accept anything less than $1 a word. if I did that, I wouldn't eat. I wouldn't work. And it would go back to being a hobby. So I think, and this is just my own experience. It might be different for other people, but freelancing, it really is the long game and the short game all at the same time, and thinking about what is your support system that makes this career possible. Because it's a constant, every day, it's a fight for their career. That can, nobody's promising you that, a paycheck next week or next month or next year. No. You need to really make it happen on a day-by-day basis. And it's not that I'm feeling anxiety attacks over it, but I do have the thought about once a month, like, maybe this is the last month that I can swing it. Thankfully, I've been able to make it work now for about 8 years, and I intend to keep going with it. But to be a freelancer, you really have to fight.
Are you a fighter?
Oh, yeah. I'll fight anyone here. I won't, just kidding.
We're very close to the end of our time. If we have a short question here, we can take that.
Yes, I have a quick question about, since you guys have your eyes and ears on the field and you're aware of journalists going back to the same sources over and over again, if you have any positive recommendations for where we can look for or how we can include more non-traditional scientists' voices in our writing.
That's a really good question. I think if you see the same name pop up over and over again, it's, they are a good person to touch on because they will probably know a lot about the field, but I think you can ask them. I want to get more diversity in my sources. Who else do you recommend? They'll probably give you 5. I would, if someone said, I want some more cool women paleontologists. I'd like, oh great, I got 10 for you right here, or people from other countries, or outside the U.S. Sure. I mean, I think asking your sources maybe that you like a lot, just for some of them, it might not come naturally to suggest other people. So you might have to ask, but I'm sure they will. But people like being asked themselves. They're not necessarily gonna immediately give you 10 other names. But I mean, for me, and I think a lot of us are very happy to help.
Yeah.
Also, just to plug, 500 Women Scientists has a database on their website that you can search. I'm sure everybody knows this by now, but I've used it a bunch and it's very helpful. And even I found someone on that and they weren't appropriate, but they gave me 2 other great people to talk to. So I get best advice from other scientists.
2 best questions every journalist should always be asking: what did I forget to ask? And who else should I talk to?
Yes.
Brian, what do you do?
I mean, that's one thing I do. I try to talk to experts or people that I've developed associations with, saying, okay, I'm looking for a different outside perspective. Can you recommend anybody? One of the other things I do is I just look at some of the search terms that in the topic that I'm writing about, whether it's a time period or a specific taxon or group of animals, and I just pop that in Google Scholar. I set it to like the past 5 years, and I just look at the author lists, and I try to say, okay, who else has written about these same groups of animals, and extending some of these questions to people who are graduate students and postdocs and stuff. I think oftentimes there is a a prevalence of like, well, we need to talk to the established like professor or scientist or tenured person, when like I feel like there's an imbalance in this where oftentimes male paleontologists will get quotes and cited and everything else like while they're still in graduate schools or doing their masters, but we don't extend that same courtesy to really anybody else. And recognize like, oh, there's an imbalance here. I can, they're still an expert about their field and what they're doing. So not only asking around, but using some of the search tools that are out there to see who else that I might not have heard of yet or coming up in the field, because there are hundreds of people, and it's as you mentioned, it's easy to run into like the same 5 or 10 paleo people who may get back to you really fast and have really good quotes, but this is part of the story of the field itself, is who is doing it and where and how they're doing it, and if we're talking to the same 5 people, we're not really doing our job.
Yeah. Well, on that note, I'd like to wrap this conversation up. I don't know about the same 5 people, but these 2 people here have just given us an extraordinary insight into what I think to some people might think is sort of a kind of curious backwater of science journalism, and given us a clear sense of just how central this is to what we do. I thank you very, very much for that.
Thank you.
I don't know if you can hear all those people online
Yeah,
or
they're all-
applauding.
We'll see the likes.
I'm
No,
hoping
seriously, clapping.
if you want to just sort of hang informally here for a little bit.